Emily Blackwell, a promising young journalist, moves to a mid-sized city to work for a local newspaper. She's excited about the opportunity to prove herself, but also faces challenges adjusting to her new job and the unfamiliar city. She's been tasked with investigating a series of strange disappearances that have baffled the police. Emily Blackwell wasn't used to being in the spotlight. She was the kind of person who quietly observed the world around her, noticing the details others missed, reading between the lines and following the stories that mattered. She had worked hard to get here. After years of writing for smaller publications, she had finally landed a full-time position at the Midway Post, the largest newspaper in the city. She was young, only 26, and had earned her stripes with a few hard-hitting investigative pieces that had attracted some attention. But this was different. This was a big city, full of stories, full of life, and full of people who thought they were the ones making the headlines. Emily had come here to prove herself, to find the big story that would launch her career to the next level. This was her chance. It wasn't just about ambition, though. Emily had always been fascinated by the hidden stories of the world, the ones people ignored, the ones left to simmer in the shadows. And she believed that those stories could change the world. She wanted to be the one to uncover them, expose the truth. It was that drive that led her to journalism in the first place. But no one had warned her about the feeling of being small in a city so vast and unknown. She still vividly remembered her first night in the city, arriving in a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of old carpet and new paint, surrounded by the strange hum of traffic and distant sirens. The unfamiliarity gnawed at her, a constant reminder that she wasn't quite at home yet. She spent the first few days acclimating herself to the hustle of city life, learning the streets, the rhythms of her new environment, and finding the best coffee spots in the area. But the excitement of living in a big city soon wore off. She realized that every city had its shadows, the parts that people didn't talk about, those gritty corners where the real stories lay. Emily's apartment was small, perched above an aging deli on 12th Avenue, a part of town that seemed stuck in time. The walls were thin, and the constant hum of the nearby street traffic became a nightly lullaby. She could hear the distant conversations of people who lived on the same block, but they were strangers to her, and she preferred it that way. She liked keeping a distance, both emotionally and physically, from the unfamiliar faces that came and went. Her office at the Midway Post was only a few blocks away, so she would walk there every day, getting to know the rhythm of the city in her own quiet way. The streets were always alive with people hurrying to their destinations, lost in their own worlds, as if they were all playing their part in some grand, unseen narrative. Emily observed it all, soaking in the city's pulse, but it wasn't until her first assignment hit her desk that she felt like she was truly a part of the fabric of this city. Her editor, Jack Harris, a gruff, no-nonsense type of guy who had been with the paper for years, had handed her the first big assignment, investigating a series of strange disappearances happening around 12th Avenue. The police had been baffled, no leads, no suspects, just people vanishing without a trace. The disappearances were becoming a disturbing trend, and the fact that they seemed to occur in a forgotten part of town only added to the mystery. 12th Avenue had long been a rundown area, once thriving but now mostly overlooked, a patchwork of dilapidated buildings, sketchy stores, and dark alleyways. "It's all yours, Emily," Jack had said, handing her the folder with a serious expression. Dig into it. I want something more than what the cops are saying. People are talking, but no one has pieced it together. I think you can find the angle." The disappearances, according to the police, didn't seem to fit a particular pattern. There were no common traits between the missing individuals. They weren't related. They didn't share jobs, hobbies, or even family ties. They were all just ordinary people living ordinary lives until they weren't. The first case had been the disappearance of Sarah Mills, a young woman in her late 20s who worked at a local coffee shop. She was last seen leaving work on a Friday evening. By Sunday morning, she was gone. No signs of struggle, no messages left behind, and most disturbingly, her belongings were still in her apartment. Then there was David Simmons, a middle-aged man who ran a small printing press on 12th Avenue. He had been out for a walk when he disappeared without a trace. His neighbors didn't hear anything unusual, and no one saw anything strange on the street that night. His wife had gone to bed, and when she woke up, he was gone. Just gone. It wasn't just the disappearances themselves that were chilling. It was the complete lack of evidence. Emily had read through the case files, and each story was more frustrating than the last. The families were distraught. The police were stumped, and the press had mostly ignored the disappearances, attributing them to either runaways or just another case of city crime. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than what the authorities were saying. As she read through the reports, a nagging question began to form in the back of her mind. Why 12th Avenue? It wasn't the kind of place where people usually disappeared. It was run down, sure, but there was something about the area that felt different, as though it had been forgotten, or perhaps it was being overlooked on purpose. When Emily first heard the whispers about urban legends tied to 12th Avenue, she laughed them off. She had worked in enough small towns and seen enough conspiracy theories to know that people could be drawn to strange explanations when they didn't have the facts. "It's probably just a coincidence," she thought, dismissing the rumors about shadowy figures, rituals, and disappearances tied to some ancient curse. But as Emily started to dig deeper, she met people who didn't just believe the stories, they feared them. The old-timers at the coffee shops, the homeless men by the bus stops, even the occasional passerby, all whispered the same tale. The shadows on 12th Avenue, a legend that had been around for decades, but no one ever dared to speak about it openly. People who vanished were rumored to have been taken by the shadows, a mysterious, malevolent force that had lingered in the area for as long as anyone could remember. It sounded absurd to Emily, and she wasn't one to believe in myths or old wives' tales. But the more she learned, the more unsettling her investigation became. Emily begins her investigation into the disappearances by speaking with locals and digging into archives. She uncovers a disturbing pattern of people vanishing on 12th Avenue, but no one seems to care. As she digs deeper, she finds herself haunted by strange noises and unsettling encounters with residents who warn her to stop asking questions. The morning after receiving the assignment, Emily set out to meet the locals and gather some initial information. The Midway Post had provided her with a list of names, families of the missing, and a few old-time residents who might still remember something about the neighborhood's past. Emily was hopeful. She believed that if she could speak to the right people, she'd uncover the truth behind the disappearances. Her first stop was Danny Marks, a grizzled old man in his late 60s who had lived on 12th Avenue for most of his life. He was sitting on a bench outside a rundown diner, a cigarette dangling from his lips, looking as though the world had passed him by years ago. "Danny," Emily asked cautiously, holding out her hand. "I'm Emily Blackwell, a reporter with the Midway Post. I'm looking into the disappearances that have been happening around 12th Avenue. I was hoping you might have some insight." Danny looked at her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to assess whether she was worth his time. After a long pause, he took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly, letting the smoke curl up into the sky. "Disappearances, huh?" he muttered. "What's your angle, Missy? People come and go around here all the time. Nothing new, ain't nothing for you to write about." Emily tried not to let his dismissive attitude affect her. "I'm just trying to understand what's been happening, Danny. There's a pattern. A lot of people have gone missing. No one seems to have answers." Danny scoffed, flicking his cigarette to the ground and grinding it out with his boot. "Pattern, you say? Ain't no pattern, just bad luck. People leave or they don't come back. It's the way of the world." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you'd be wise to stay out of it. People like us. We don't mess with things that don't concern us." His cryptic warning sent a chill down Emily's spine, but she wasn't about to back down. She had a job to do. "But surely you've noticed something strange, something unusual that could help explain why these people keep disappearing." Danny just stared at her for a moment, then looked away. "You should go," he said, standing up slowly. "You don't know what you're asking about." Undeterred, Emily continued her search. She visited a series of other local sources, neighbors, store owners, and elderly residents who might have been around for the long-term changes in the area. Each person she met had a similar reaction. They were hesitant to speak, and some outright refused to discuss the disappearances. It was as if an invisible barrier surrounded the topic, one no one dared to cross. After a couple of frustrating days, Emily's breakthrough came in the form of Marge Sullivan, an older woman who owned a small bookstore near the outskirts of 12th Avenue. Marge had seen the neighborhood change over the years, and her sharp memory made her an invaluable source. When Emily mentioned the disappearances, Marge stiffened, and for a moment, Emily thought she would refuse to talk, too, but then Marge leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're asking about them, aren't you?" Marge's voice trembled slightly. "The shadows." Emily froze, unsure if she had heard her correctly. "The shadows." Marge nodded, her eyes scanning the dimly lit corners of her bookstore as if making sure no one was listening. "You're too young to remember, dear, but I'll tell you. There's an old legend around here, one that goes way back. The shadows aren't just stories, they are real, and they've been haunting this neighborhood for generations." Emily's interest piqued. "What do you mean? Who are they? Why have they been connected to the disappearances?" Marge hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door. "The shadows are. They're not like people. Some say they're spirits, others say they're something older, something darker." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "They're said to follow people, latch onto them and take them, but they never leave any trace, nothing but empty space where they once were, and every so often someone vanishes and the shadows get stronger." Emily felt a shiver creep down her spine. "But why 12th Avenue? Why here?" Marge's eyes darkened. "I don't know exactly. All I know is that there's something wrong with this street, something old and dangerous. They say it's because the land here is cursed, used to be something else long ago. People who live on 12th Avenue, they're just waiting for it to come for them. It's only a matter of time." The more Emily learned, the more unsettled she became. The residents of 12th Avenue weren't just afraid of the disappearances. They were terrified of the unknown, of something unseen yet very real lurking in the shadows. By the end of her second week, Emily was already feeling the weight of the investigation. She started to notice unusual occurrences around her apartment. The once quiet street outside now seemed to be filled with noise at night, strange echoes and creaks, as though the buildings themselves were alive, breathing with an energy she couldn't quite place. One evening, Emily sat at her desk, going through her notes when she heard a faint tapping sound at her window. It was soft at first, like the patter of raindrops, but it grew louder, more insistent. She stood up and walked cautiously to the window, pulling aside the curtain. But there was nothing there, just the empty street, bathed in the cold glow of the street lights. Shaken, she turned back to her desk, but when she glanced down at the papers in front of her, she froze. There, scribbled on one of the pages, was a message. "The shadows are watching you." Emily felt her pulse quicken. She knew she hadn't written it. The handwriting was messy, jagged, almost childlike. Who had been in her apartment? She quickly locked the window and checked every door, but the eerie feeling lingered. That night, she didn't sleep well, and in the silence of her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The strange occurrences didn't stop. As Emily continued her investigation, the stories she had uncovered seemed to haunt her, and the line between reality and superstition began to blur. Her skepticism about urban legends was fading. Was it possible that something supernatural was really happening on 12th Avenue? Or was it all just a string of coincidences? Emily felt she was being pulled deeper into a mystery she hadn't fully understood. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how little she actually knew. Every lead only brought more questions. Every interview left her with unanswered fears. But despite everything, Emily couldn't stop now. She had to know the truth, no matter where it took her. Emily receives an anonymous tip that connects the disappearances to a long-abandoned building on 12th Avenue. The tipster claims to have witnessed something horrific inside the building years ago, but won't say more. Emily becomes obsessed with this lead and begins researching the building's history. After the unsettling events that had unfolded over the past couple of weeks, Emily found herself at a crossroads. The disappearances, the warnings from the locals, and the whispers of the shadows were starting to weigh on her mind. It was as if she had stepped into a web of mystery and terror that she couldn't escape. But Emily was nothing if not determined. She was a reporter, and the truth, no matter how dark, was what she had been trained to seek. She couldn't back down now. Her instincts were telling her there was something important, something vital that she hadn't yet discovered. That night, as she sat at her desk, reviewing her notes on the missing persons, something unusual caught her eye. A small envelope slipped under the door of her apartment. She hadn't noticed it earlier. No return address, no name, just a single typed sheet of paper inside. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. "The building on 12th Avenue, the old Tilden warehouse. You need to go inside. It's all connected." The message was cryptic, but Emily knew instantly what it meant. The Tilden warehouse was an abandoned factory, once a bustling part of the city's industrial hub, now just a relic of the past. Emily had heard of it before. The locals referred to it as the Ghost Building. It was located on the edge of 12th Avenue, right next to where most of the disappearances had taken place. She had heard rumors about the place but had dismissed them as just that, rumors. But now, this anonymous tip seemed to confirm that there was something there worth investigating. Emily's heart raced as she made a mental note to visit the Tilden warehouse. This could be the breakthrough she needed, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. The next morning, Emily went straight to work. She spent hours researching the history of the Tilden warehouse, and what she found sent a chill down her spine. The building had been in operation for over 50 years before it had been abandoned about 2 decades ago. It had been a key player in the city's manufacturing economy, producing everything from steel to machinery. But its closure wasn't due to a decline in business. It was a mysterious incident that had occurred in the late 1990s. In the winter of 1997, a massive fire had broken out inside the warehouse. Official reports claimed it was an accident. Some faulty equipment sparked the blaze, but rumors suggested otherwise. The fire had destroyed much of the building, leaving it unsafe and uninhabitable. The real mystery, however, lay in the number of employees who had gone missing during the fire. According to the records, 7 workers had been inside when the fire started, but only 2 of them were found. The others vanished without a trace. No bodies, no evidence of their whereabouts, just a charred building and the unanswered question of where they had gone. Even more disturbing was a comment from an old firefighter, a retired man named John Greer, who had been at the scene. His words, though brief, were chilling. "I've seen a lot in my career, but what happened there? That wasn't just a fire. It was like something pulled them into the flames, something that wasn't supposed to be there." Emily felt a cold sweat break out across her skin as she read those words. The shadows. Was it possible that the disappearances were tied to something so ancient, so dark, that no one dared speak of it? Could the Tilden warehouse be the place where it all began? As Emily continued her research, the sense of dread grew. She couldn't ignore the whispers of something sinister tied to the warehouse, something that might go beyond a simple fire and missing persons. In the weeks following the fire, strange things were reported. Some of the fire survivors claimed to have seen odd figures in the smoke, shadows that didn't belong. Others reported hearing strange voices from inside the burned remains of the building, voices that didn't belong to anyone who had been inside. Emily was determined to visit the building in person. She had to know if there was any truth to these strange stories. The more she uncovered, the more it felt like she was being pulled into a dark mystery she couldn't escape. She arrived at the Tilden warehouse in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the desolate street. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows and decaying walls a reminder of the past. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease wash over her as she stood at the entrance. The once grand structure, now little more than a hollow shell of its former self. She took a deep breath and pushed open the rusted gate. As she stepped inside, the air grew heavier, colder, as though the building itself was breathing around her. The remnants of the fire were still visible, burned steel beams and charred bricks scattered across the floor. The warehouse smelled faintly of smoke, though the fire had been long extinguished. Emily moved cautiously through the wreckage, snapping photos and jotting down notes. But something was off. The deeper she ventured into the warehouse, the more the atmosphere shifted. It was as though the shadows were moving around her, creeping closer with each step. Suddenly, she heard it, a faint whisper just on the edge of her hearing. She froze. It wasn't just the wind. The whisper was too distinct, too human. Her heart began to race as she turned in circles, but there was no one there. She was alone, or so she thought. As Emily walked deeper into the building, she came upon a small, abandoned office tucked away in the back corner. Inside, the air felt thicker, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. On the desk, an old photograph lay face up. The picture was black and white, showing a group of factory workers standing outside the warehouse. The workers all looked cheerful, smiling for the camera, but there was something wrong about it, something about the eyes of the people in the photo. They were hollow, like empty sockets, as though the life had been drained from them. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had to get out. The next day, Emily returned to the office to review her findings, but as she sifted through the notes, a sudden feeling of being watched gripped her. She checked her email, and there was a message waiting for her, no subject, just a single line. "Stop asking questions. The building doesn't want you here." She scanned the message, trying to make sense of it. The tone was ominous, threatening. It was a warning, but from whom? Emily couldn't ignore it, though. Whoever had sent the message clearly knew she had been at the warehouse. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. She had only shared her findings with a few close colleagues and sources. How could anyone know what she had discovered? It was as if someone was watching her every move. As the days passed, Emily started to question the reliability of her sources. The more she dug into the past of the warehouse and the disappearances, the more dead ends she encountered. Each person she spoke to either refused to comment or gave vague, conflicting information. Marge, the bookstore owner, had warned her, and now Emily was beginning to wonder if there were forces at play that even she couldn't understand. Was she dealing with a simple case of missing persons, or was there something far more supernatural at work? The further she went, the more Emily realized that the more questions she asked, the more she was being drawn into the shadows, just like the people who had vanished. Emily visits the abandoned building on 12th Avenue. As she enters, she feels a strange presence, like someone is watching her. The building is decrepit, with remnants of its past hidden in the shadows. She discovers disturbing symbols carved into the walls and a room filled with old photographs of people who resemble the missing persons. It had been 2 days since Emily received the anonymous tip pointing her to the Tilden warehouse. She couldn't stop thinking about it, about the fire, the disappearances, and the chilling warning she had received. The urge to understand what had happened here gnawed at her, and she knew she couldn't put off her visit any longer. Today, she would go inside. The sun was beginning to set as Emily made her way down 12th Avenue, the dimming light casting long shadows across the street. The area was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic from the highway. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and tattered walls like an open wound in the heart of the city. Once, it had been a thriving industrial center, but now, it was a decaying skeleton of its former self. Graffiti covered most of the outer walls, and the rusted gate creaked loudly as she pushed it open. The air inside the warehouse was thick with dust, and the stale, metallic smell of old machinery filled her nostrils. She could hear her footsteps echoing off the walls as she stepped deeper into the building, the only sound breaking the heavy silence that surrounded her. It was a world of forgotten relics, each corner filled with broken crates and rotting wooden beams that creaked with the slightest movement. The building felt frozen in time, as though nothing had moved or changed in decades. The first thing that struck Emily was the darkness inside. Despite it being late afternoon, the light barely filtered through the grime-covered windows. The air was cold, almost unnaturally cold, as though the building itself was rejecting her presence. As she walked further into the space, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. There was an odd sensation in the air, an energy she couldn't quite place, like something was watching her from the shadows. She continued through the massive warehouse, moving deeper into the labyrinth of decaying machinery and rubble. The further she ventured, the stronger the feeling became. It was subtle at first, just a flicker at the edge of her vision, a shifting in the shadows. But by the time she reached the back corner, the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Emily paused and glanced around, her breath catching in her throat. The warehouse seemed to stretch on forever, each darkened corridor leading to more uncertainty. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft rustling of debris underfoot and the occasional distant drip of water. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as she moved cautiously down a narrow hallway, the darkness swallowing her whole. Her flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. She hesitated, adjusting the beam, and then proceeded forward. But the closer she got to the back of the building, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. She couldn't explain it. Her skin was crawling and her heart was pounding in her chest. The air was thick, as though something ancient and wrong was hanging in the space, waiting. It wasn't just the eerie quiet or the dilapidation of the building that unsettled her. It was the overwhelming sense of history that pressed in on her, the feeling that the walls themselves held secrets far darker than any fire or accident could explain. Her flashlight caught something ahead. She stepped cautiously toward it. Emily found herself in what appeared to be an old storage room, hidden away behind stacks of decaying crates and rusted machinery. The floor was littered with old papers, yellowed with age, and what looked like faded blueprints of the warehouse's original plans. But what caught her eye wasn't the paper. It was a wall near the back of the room, covered in strange symbols. The symbols were deeply carved into the wall, some of them overlapping, others running in long, spiraling patterns. They looked like ancient runes, but Emily had never seen anything quite like them before. Her heart skipped a beat as she traced her fingers along the grooves of one of the symbols. It was cold, too cold, and something about it made her stomach churn. The symbols didn't seem to belong to any known language or cultures she could recognize. They felt foreign, almost alien. She stepped back, feeling a growing unease settle deep in her chest. The room felt heavier now, the shadows longer, as if something were creeping closer, watching her every move. Then, as her flashlight swept across the far side of the room, she froze. On the wall, partially hidden behind an old tarp, were photographs. Faded black and white images stuck to the wall with old, peeling tape. They were of people workers, she assumed. But there was something unsettling about them. They all looked eerily similar, pale faces, hollow eyes, and vacant expressions. And in the back of the room, just behind the people in the photos, was a dark shape, almost like a shadow, too dark, too featureless, lurking in the background. One of the photographs caught her attention in particular. It was of a group of factory workers, standing in front of the very building she was standing in. She recognized some of the faces, their vacant expressions, the same hollow eyes. Her breath caught as she realized that some of the workers in the photograph resembled the missing persons from her investigation. There among them was Sarah Mills, the first woman who had vanished. Her heart raced. She was right. The building had something to do with the disappearances. But what was its connection to the shadows? Was it just coincidence, or was there a deeper, more disturbing reason behind the people's disappearance? As Emily stepped back from the photographs, she felt a strange coldness wash over her, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift. For a brief moment, she could have sworn she saw something, a figure, standing at the far end of the room. But when she turned quickly, there was nothing there, just the shadows stretching and pulling at the edges of her vision. Her flashlight flickered once again, casting an eerie glow over the room. But now she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It was as if the building itself was alive, responding to her presence, watching her. Her hands trembled as she held the flashlight steady, the beam illuminating the dark corners of the room. She moved cautiously toward the back exit, but just as she stepped forward, she heard it, a soft whisper almost too faint to catch. "Leave." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't human. There was something otherworldly about it. A chill ran down her spine and she froze in place, staring into the shadows. The temperature seemed to drop even further and Emily's mind raced. She had read about people feeling a presence, an unexplainable energy in haunted places, but this was different. There was no denying it now. The shadows were real, and they were here. She quickly turned to leave, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she reached for the door, she could have sworn she saw something move in the corner of her eye. A shadow, too dark to be real, too unnatural to ignore, shifted, its edges creeping closer. The warehouse was no longer just a building. It was a prison, and the shadows were watching her every move. Strange things begin to happen to Emily after her visit to the building. She receives mysterious calls, and her phone displays photos she didn't take. People start following her, and she feels paranoid. Her journalistic instincts clash with her growing fear. The more she investigates, the more she feels she's being drawn into something beyond her control. The days following her visit to the Tilden warehouse blurred together. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had shifted. Every shadow in her apartment seemed darker, every creak of the floorboards seemed louder. She felt like she was being watched, even when she was alone. It started with the phone calls. The first one came late at night, when Emily was trying to unwind after another long day of research. She had just gotten comfortable on the couch, sipping on a cup of tea, when her phone rang. Glanced at the screen. It was a private number. She hesitated, unsure whether to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The line was silent for a moment. Then she heard it, a faint, soft whisper. "Leave it alone." Emily froze, her blood running cold. The voice was low, almost garbled, but she could tell it was a man's voice. It sent a jolt of panic through her chest, and before she could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It could have been a prank, she thought, but it didn't feel like one. There was something unnatural about it, something that set her nerves on edge. She tried calling the number back, but it rang once and then went straight to voicemail. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Whoever this was, they had no intention of letting her know who they were. The phone call was just the beginning. The next morning, Emily was reviewing her notes when she noticed something strange. She opened her phone's gallery, expecting to find photos from the previous day's walk through the city. But to her surprise, there were new photos there, photos she didn't take. The images were blurry, indistinct, and distorted, but each one showed a dark figure standing just beyond the edge of the frame. Figures that didn't belong. There were no obvious faces, just shadows, standing too still, too unnatural. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She scrolled through the images, her hands trembling. These weren't pictures of the warehouse. No, these were from outside her apartment, taken at night in the same shadowy areas where she had seen the strange, shifting figures before. She had never taken these photos, and she knew with a sickening certainty that someone or something had been watching her. She immediately checked the time stamps on the photos. The photos had been taken after she had fallen asleep, and the last one had been taken in the middle of the night while she was deep in slumber. Who had been in her apartment? The strange occurrences began to escalate. Over the next few days, Emily heard whispers at night, soft voices just beyond the edge of hearing. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, but when she got up to check, there would be no one there. Her apartment felt increasingly alive with presence, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. The shadows in her apartment became darker, more pronounced. She noticed them out of the corner of her eye, figures that flickered in and out of view just outside the range of her peripheral vision. She would glance over, only to find nothing there. It wasn't just the apartment. Even when she left her building, she felt eyes on her. On several occasions, she noticed someone following her, a man in a dark coat, walking several paces behind her, no matter which direction she turned. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being stalked, and when she tried to confront him, he would disappear into the crowd, melting into the background as though he had never been there. Her mind was starting to play tricks on her. Was she really being followed, or was it just the fear beginning to take root? One evening, she decided to confront the paranoia head-on. She left her apartment and deliberately walked in circles around the block, hoping to catch whoever was tailing her. As she turned down an alleyway, she turned abruptly and saw him, the man in the coat, standing at the far end, just standing there watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. She started toward him, but before she could get close, he turned and disappeared down an alley, melting into the shadows once again. Gone without a trace. Emily's growing paranoia wasn't confined to just her physical surroundings. It started to spill over into her personal life as well. Her colleagues at the Midway Post began to notice a change in her behavior. She was more distracted, less focused during meetings. She would often look over her shoulder, her gaze darting nervously around the room. It was becoming clear that the lines between her personal life and her investigation were beginning to blur. Even her friends and family began to notice the shift. Her best friend, Megan, who lived across town, invited Emily out for drinks one evening. But when they met at the bar, Emily was distant, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd. "You okay?" Megan asked, raising an eyebrow. "You've been acting off lately." Emily didn't know how to explain it. How could she tell Megan that she felt like she was losing control, that something unseen was starting to take hold of her? She shrugged, trying to play it off. "I'm just stressed," she lied. "Work's been crazy, and this investigation, it's a lot." But Megan didn't seem convinced. "You've been going non-stop for weeks, Em. Maybe it's time to take a break." Emily tried to shake off the anxiety creeping up her chest. She was too deep into the story now, there was no going back. But as she looked around the bar, she couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching her, that the shadows were closing in. Later that night, as she returned to her apartment, Emily noticed something strange on her doorstep. A small, folded note with no return address. Just a single line written in bold, block letters. "Stop asking questions, it's too late for you now." Her stomach churned as she stared at the note. This was no coincidence. The shadows had found her. Emily's investigation brings her into contact with an elderly man who claims to know the truth about the disappearances. He tells her stories from his youth about 12th Avenue, revealing dark secrets that have been buried for decades. He warns her that the people behind the disappearances are not just criminals. They are something much darker. Emily had been chasing leads for weeks, but nothing felt as significant as the strange encounter she had with Sam Hargrove, a frail old man who lived in a small house near the outskirts of 12th Avenue. He was known in the neighborhood for his quiet demeanor, his half-blind eyes, and the faint scent of dust and tobacco that always seemed to linger around him. He had lived in the area for decades, and many said he'd seen more than his fair share of trouble on 12th Avenue. Emily first heard about Sam from a local bookstore owner who described him as a living history book. He was someone who had lived through the days when 12th Avenue was bustling and alive, back when it was a place of prosperity before it was swallowed by decay. Sam had been a young man during the heyday of the warehouse and the factories, and the bookstore owner believed he might know something about the strange occurrences in the area. Sam's house was a small, sagging building at the end of a narrow street. It was hard to imagine anyone still lived there. Its windows were dark, and the garden had long since turned into an unkempt mass of weeds. Emily knocked on the door, unsure of what she was going to find on the other side. When the door creaked open, she found Sam sitting in a dusty armchair, staring out the window, his eyes clouded by age. "You must be Emily Blackwell," he said, his voice raspy as though it hadn't been used much in years. "Yes, I am. I'm investigating the disappearances on 12th Avenue," Emily said, feeling a bit uncomfortable in the stillness of the room. "I was hoping you could help me understand what happened here." Sam didn't answer at first, his gaze lingering on the window as though he was looking for something in the distance. Finally, he motioned for her to sit. "You want to know about 12th Avenue, eh?" Sam asked with a slow, deliberate tone. "You're looking for answers, I suppose." "I am," Emily replied, sitting cautiously across from him. "I know people have gone missing around here, and I believe it's connected to the old warehouse. Do you know anything about that?" Sam's eyes flickered with something, whether it was recognition or fear, Emily couldn't tell. He sighed deeply and leaned forward in his chair as if bracing himself. "You should have stayed away, girl." He shook his head. "But you won't listen. I can see that, just like everyone else who has come here asking questions." Sam's voice trembled as he began to speak, as if the words he was about to say carried weight he hadn't shared in years. "I grew up on these streets," he began, his voice quieter now. "Back when this was still a neighborhood, back when 12th Avenue wasn't just some ghost of its former self. I worked in the warehouse for years, the same warehouse you've been poking around in." Emily listened intently, her pen hovering above the notebook. "What happened there? Why did so many people disappear?" Sam took a long pause, his hands shaking as he clutched his cane. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Finally, he spoke. "There's a story no one tells you, no one talks about anymore," he said, "about what happened in that building, and what still happens." He looked Emily in the eyes, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something almost desperate. They weren't just people disappearing. It was the warehouse, the place itself. Something was in there, something dark. "I never should have stayed in that job, but I was young and didn't know better." Emily's heart raced. "What do you mean something was in there?" Sam lowered his voice to a near whisper. "The shadows." He looked around as though to make sure no one was listening, even though they were alone. "They were real, Emily, not just some stupid ghost story. They were connected to the building. They were what took people." Emily swallowed hard. "The shadows, what do you mean? Are you saying it wasn't just criminals?" "No, no," Sam muttered, shaking his head. "It wasn't the criminals, it was something older. The fire. It wasn't just an accident. Something in that warehouse was waking up, and when it woke up it started taking people, anyone who got too close." He leaned forward, lowering his voice even further. "The people who vanished. They were never really gone, not in the way you think. They were absorbed. The shadows pulled them into the walls, into the dark, into the void. They were part of it now." Emily felt a cold chill run down her spine. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they weren't adding up in the way she had expected. Why didn't anyone stop it? she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sam's expression grew grim. Because no one believed it. Everyone thought it was just a story. The people in charge, the cops, the city, they didn't want to know. And when they saw what was happening, they turned a blind eye. People who lived through it didn't want to remember. People like me tried to warn them, but it's too late now. He paused, his eyes becoming distant as if he were seeing the past unfold before him. It started with the fire. People thought it was just bad luck, but the fire, it broke the seal. It woke up something that had been buried, and now it's back. Emily was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Sam had said. Could it be true? The shadows, this was far darker than she had imagined. But how could something like that be real? Was it all just in his mind, a product of age and paranoia? She glanced at Sam, whose eyes were now clouded with a mix of regret and fear. "What are you trying to tell me, Sam? Don't go back to that building, girl." Sam's voice cracked with emotion. "You've seen too much. It's not just a warehouse, it's a door. And the shadows, they won't let you leave once they know you've opened it." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. The stories, the warnings, the strange occurrences, had she already crossed the line? Had she gone too far by investigating the Tilden warehouse, by uncovering what was hidden beneath the surface? Sam sat back in his chair, eyes shut tight as if haunted by his own memories. "If you want to know the truth," he muttered, "you'll have to face them, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Emily walked away from Sam's house, her mind was a whirlwind of questions. The truth Sam had shared with her about the shadows, about the people who had disappeared and the horrors hidden in the warehouse, was too much to process all at once. It was clear that something supernatural was at play, something that went beyond a simple criminal investigation. The question now was, how could she stop it? Could she even stop it at all? Her dread grew as she thought back to her recent experiences. The strange photos on her phone, the whispers at night, the feeling of being watched. Had the shadows already marked her? She glanced behind her as she walked, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing there. She took a deep breath, pushing the fear aside. She couldn't back down. She had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. But as she continued down the street, the oppressive feeling that had followed her for days only intensified. Was she in over her head? Emily begins to notice a pattern in the disappearances. The victims are all connected to certain individuals, all of whom have a history with 12th Avenue. She discovers a secret group known as the Collective, who have been manipulating people for decades, but their motives remain unclear. The more Emily dug into the missing persons cases, the more she began to see a troubling pattern. At first, the disappearances had seemed random, different ages, different professions, different backgrounds. But the more she researched, the more it became apparent that all of the missing individuals shared one crucial link. They had all lived or worked in close proximity to 12th Avenue. Sarah Mills, the young barista who had vanished first, had grown up in a rundown apartment building near the Tilden warehouse. David Simmons, the middle-aged printing press owner, had worked in a shop on the same street. Marion Clark, an artist who had disappeared 2 months ago, used to rent studio space in a building just 2 blocks from the warehouse. As Emily gathered information, she also began to notice that many of these people had interacted with the same small group of individuals who frequented 12th Avenue. These individuals weren't just casual acquaintances. Many of them were long-time residents with deep ties to the area's past, ties that went back to a time long before the building had fallen into disrepair. It was like a web, with 12th Avenue at its center, and all of the missing people connected to it in ways she hadn't fully realized until now. She spent hours comparing old records, tax documents, public service files, even old newspaper clippings, looking for anything that could connect the missing individuals. What she found made her stomach turn. Many of the people who had disappeared had lived near each other, worked near each other, or had crossed paths with the same set of influential figures in the city. These figures had all been active in the area for decades, even when it had been considered off-limits or dangerous. Emily's breakthrough came when she tracked down a name that kept appearing in her research: Calvin Pierce. Pierce was an unassuming man, an older gentleman who had been involved in various civic organizations in the city. On paper, he seemed like a pillar of the community, but Emily discovered something that disturbed her deeply. Calvin Pierce had been connected to nearly every missing person in some capacity, whether as a business partner, a landlord, or a community leader. The more Emily looked into Pierce, the more she realized that he wasn't acting alone. There were others, quiet figures in the background of the city's history, who had helped shape its political landscape for decades. Emily uncovered references to a group known as the Collective. At first, it seemed like just another conspiracy theory, something that could easily be dismissed. But the deeper Emily dug, the more she discovered about this secretive group. The Collective wasn't just a loose association. It was a powerful network of individuals who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes for decades, using their influence to manipulate businesses, local politics, and even the lives of the city's residents. They were tied to the origins of the Tilden warehouse and its eventual downfall. The fire in 1997 wasn't just a tragic accident. It had been part of their plan. The disappearances were just the latest chapter in a much larger, darker story. The Collective had used the chaos to cover their tracks and solidify their power. Emily found an old journal entry from a local politician that mentioned the Collective in passing, describing them as a group of individuals with nefarious intentions. There were references to illegal land deals, bribery, and corruption in the city's early history. But the deeper Emily got into the files, the more she realized the group's reach extended far beyond politics. It was all connected. The Collective had manipulated the lives of the city's residents for years, and now it was clear they were controlling the disappearances. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place for Emily. The disappearances were not random. They were part of a larger scheme, a plan that had been unfolding for years. People like Calvin Pierce had been using their influence over 12th Avenue and its residents for their own gain. And those who had crossed them, or those who had stumbled too close to the truth, were disappearing, swallowed by the dark forces that ruled the shadows. Emily sat at her desk, surrounded by notes, old documents, and the fading photographs she had found. It was overwhelming, the sheer depth of the conspiracy she had uncovered. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The Collective was the key to everything. They were the ones pulling the strings, orchestrating the disappearances, and ensuring that no one ever pieced the puzzle together. She realized with a sinking feeling that the more she uncovered, the more dangerous things would get. The Collective wasn't just a group of powerful businessmen and politicians. They were the real threat. They were the ones who had been manipulating the city's power for decades, and Emily was getting closer to discovering the truth. But the truth came at a price. The more Emily uncovered, the more she felt the noose tightening around her. She began to feel like she was being watched at all hours of the day. Her phone would ring with no one on the other end. People in the streets would stare at her as though they knew something she didn't. The unease that had settled in her apartment was starting to spread, creeping into every part of her life. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She was in danger, real, immediate danger. The more she learned about the collective, the more it became clear. The people behind the disappearances weren't just criminals, they were something darker. Emily sat back in her chair, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? She had no idea how far this went or how deeply the collective was involved in every aspect of the city's life. But one thing was certain. The deeper she went, the more dangerous it became, and she had no choice but to press on. Every conversation, every discovery seemed to draw Emily further into the clutches of the collective. The tension around her mounted as she continued her investigation, her every move shadowed by the growing sense that someone was watching. Her instincts screamed that she was now involved in something far bigger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. But it was too late to back out. She had uncovered too much and there was no turning back. The disappearances, the symbols, the shadows, they were all pieces of a much larger conspiracy, and Emily had just scratched the surface. As she walked the streets of the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that the collective was getting closer, and that soon they would know what she knew. Emily wasn't just an investigator anymore. She was a target. Emily's investigation leads her to the truth about the mysterious group. The collective isn't just a group of people, but a powerful secret society that controls the city's underworld. They have been using the disappearances as part of a ritual to gain power and control. Emily realizes that she's in danger of becoming their next victim. The more Emily uncovered about the collective, the more it became apparent that they were far from an ordinary group of powerful people. The facts she had uncovered in the past weeks, corruption, manipulation, and nefarious dealings, had only been the surface. The deeper Emily dug, the more she realized that the collective was not just a criminal syndicate. They were involved in something far darker, something supernatural. As Emily pored over the old journals, archived files, and the testimony of those who had worked with them, it became clear that the disappearances weren't just about control. They were part of a ritualistic practice designed to siphon power from the missing individuals. These were not just ordinary people being erased. They were being sacrificed, used to fuel a dark magic that the collective had been harnessing for decades. Emily recalled her conversations with Sam Hargrove, the elderly man who had warned her about the dark presence in the warehouse. He had mentioned something vague about the fire breaking the seal, but now it made sense. The fire in the Tilden warehouse wasn't just an accident. It had triggered a series of rituals that opened the door to a dark force, a power that the collective had been exploiting ever since. And each disappearance, each missing person, was part of a ritual sacrifice to maintain control over the city. There were references in the documents to the gathering, a secret ceremony that was held in hidden parts of the city, most likely underneath the very warehouse Emily had been investigating. The purpose of the ritual was to draw from the energies of the vanished, channeling them into a mystical force that the collective used to maintain their grip on the city's underworld. But what was most disturbing was the realization that the disappearances weren't random. They were chosen. The victims had something in common. They had either worked at or lived near the Tilden warehouse, and many had unknowingly been part of the collective's network. Emily now understood that their control wasn't just political or financial, it was spiritual. The Tilden warehouse, Emily now realized, wasn't just a site of corruption or decay. It was the epicenter of the group's power. The building had become the conduit for their rituals, a place where the boundaries between the natural world and something darker were deliberately blurred. The old symbols that Emily had found etched into the walls of the warehouse weren't random markings. They were runes, arcane symbols that had been used for centuries by secret societies like the Collective to invoke dark forces. It was no coincidence that the disappearances had started around the time of the fire. The fire had destroyed much of the building, but it had also opened a door, one that the Collective had been waiting to exploit. Emily had always assumed the warehouse was just an old factory, abandoned and forgotten. But now she realized it was much more than that. It was a ritual site, built on ancient and dark foundations, designed to draw power from those who had the misfortune of crossing paths with it. The very disappearances that she had been investigating were not just random acts of violence or criminal behavior. They were planned, orchestrated, and executed as part of a larger scheme. The victims had been deliberately chosen to fuel the ritual and empower the Collective's grip on the city. Emily felt sick to her stomach as she pieced it all together. The Collective had used the city's poverty, desperation, and discontent to manipulate people into participating in their dark rituals. The missing people weren't just casualties of the city's corruption. They were sacrifices to a force they didn't even understand. Despite the overwhelming darkness of the truth, Emily felt a surge of determination. She knew she had to expose what was happening. She had uncovered the story, the truth that no one in the city wanted to acknowledge. The more she understood, the more she realized that there was no going back. The disappearances weren't random, they were deliberate. The victims were chosen, and now Emily was the next one on the list. She spent hours at her desk, reviewing her notes, trying to make sense of everything. The pieces were falling into place. The rituals, the disappearances, the connections, they were all part of a much larger, far more dangerous story. But as she wrote, something inside her grew cold. She knew that the Collective would not let her get away with exposing them. They had done this for decades, manipulating people, erasing lives, and pulling the strings behind the scenes. What was one more life to them? But Emily couldn't back down. Her journalistic instincts screamed that she had to finish what she had started. The truth had to come out. The Collective had to be stopped. But as she thought about exposing them, Emily began to question what it would cost her. Would they come for her? What if she was already too deep into their world? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound outside her window. A rustling like the sound of a paper fluttering in the wind. A shadow moved past her window and she jumped in her seat, her heart racing. She knew she was being watched again. The sense of paranoia, the growing dread, had become so overwhelming that it was difficult to separate her fear from her reality. "You're too close, Emily," she whispered to herself, her mind reeling. "They won't let you expose them, but you can't stop now. You have to finish it." As the day wore on, Emily found herself caught in a terrifying internal struggle. On one hand, her investigative instincts urged her to press forward, to continue digging deeper, to expose the darkness behind the disappearances, to bring the Collective to justice. But on the other hand, the fear that had been creeping up inside her over the past few weeks was becoming too overwhelming. Was it worth it? Was the truth worth the risk of her life? The more she uncovered, the more she realized how far-reaching and powerful the collective was. They controlled everything: the city's power structures, its secrets, and now, possibly even her fate. In a moment of weakness, Emily considered abandoning the investigation, walking away before it consumed her. But she knew she couldn't. The story was too important. The truth needed to be exposed. The people who had gone missing needed their voices to be heard. And Emily was the only one who could uncover it. There was no going back now. Emily tries to escape the city but is hunted by members of the collective. They are everywhere, and Emily feels like she is being pulled into their world. Desperate to get away, she uses everything she's learned to fight back, but she begins to question whether she can trust anyone, even herself. The decision was made. Emily had gone too far, uncovered too much, and now there was no turning back. But the truth, once discovered, wasn't something she could easily walk away from. The collective had made it clear that they wouldn't allow anyone to reveal their secrets, no matter the cost. She had barely made it out of the warehouse the night before, and already she could feel the walls closing in. The shadows weren't just whispers anymore. They were alive, moving around her, watching her every move. She had been tracked, followed, and now they were coming for her. They were everywhere. The city's underworld had eyes on every corner, every dark alley. The very people Emily had once considered safe, the ones she thought might help her, were all tied to the collective in one way or another. She packed a small bag, grabbed her laptop, and fled her apartment in the dead of night. But every step she took away from the building felt like a step deeper into their world. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. Every face in the crowd seemed to be watching her. There was no way out. The city was alive with their presence, and she was trapped in it. Her instincts told her to get out of town, to leave everything behind, but she couldn't. She was too close to the truth. She had already crossed the line. Now there was no turning back. The more she tried to escape, the more she realized that she was being pulled in. The collective wouldn't let her go. They were after her, and they had all the resources they needed to find her. By dawn, Emily was on the run. She moved through the streets like a ghost, doing everything she could to avoid being seen. Her heart raced, her mind constantly alert, looking for signs, any signs, that someone was watching. But no matter how careful she was, she couldn't shake the feeling that the collective was one step ahead of her at all times. It started small. She'd see a dark figure in the corner of her eye, a man in a black coat crossing her path on the street, or a car parked a little too long outside her apartment. But then the sightings became more frequent, more aggressive. The figures weren't just lurking anymore, they were chasing her. Every alleyway she turned down, there they were in the shadows, watching her. Her every move was being monitored. The phone calls had continued too. Anonymous numbers calling in the middle of the night, leaving only cryptic messages. "You're still running, Emily. You can't hide from us." The voice was always different, but the message was the same. No matter how far she ran, they would find her. One night, as she made her way to a remote train station to leave the city, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being followed. She kept her head down and walked quickly, but the footsteps behind her never stopped. Each time she looked over her shoulder, the figure grew closer. A man in a dark trench coat, eyes obscured by shadows. She tried to outpace him, weaving through the crowded streets, but no matter how fast she moved, he was always there, just a step behind. At one point, she ducked into a side street, hoping to lose him, but when she turned the corner, he was already there, blocking her path. His face was hidden by the darkness, but she could feel his presence, cold, calculating, relentless. "You can't escape, Emily. It's already too late." His voice was chilling, a low whisper that sent a jolt of fear through her. Without thinking, Emily ran, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible, pumping with fear and adrenaline. She darted through alleys, leapt over obstacles, but the man kept following, his steps echoing behind her, never faltering. She knew she couldn't keep running. At some point, she'd have to stop and face whatever the collective had in store for her. She was no longer just running from the truth. She was running for her life. As the days passed, Emily's sense of reality began to warp. The line between what was happening to her and the fear inside her started to blur. The collective was everywhere. Her apartment, her office, the streets. No matter where she went, their presence was inescapable. At night, she couldn't sleep. The shadows in her room felt different now, as though they were alive, moving with a mind of their own. Sometimes she would hear soft whispers in the dark, voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She would sit up in bed, heart racing, trying to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the whispers didn't stop. One evening, she tried to reach out to Pat, her trusted colleague and one of the few people she thought she could still count on. She dialed his number, but the line was dead. She called again, but no answer, and then it happened. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was a single line of text. "You're not alone, Emily. The collective has been waiting for you." Emily froze, her hands trembling. She knew it wasn't just some random text. This was real. The collective was playing with her mind, drawing her deeper into their web. They were waiting for her to crack, to make a mistake. They knew her every move, every step. They had been controlling her from the very beginning. As the days stretched on, Emily's paranoia and fear grew. She couldn't tell if the danger she was facing was real or if she was beginning to lose her grip on reality. The city was a blur. She was moving through it like a shadow, constantly looking over her shoulder, seeing threats that may or may not be there. She began questioning everything. Had she been followed her entire life? Was it really the collective, or was it her fear taking shape? What if she was becoming paranoid? What if she was imagining the whole thing? One night she sat in a dark corner of a diner, staring at the half-empty coffee cup in front of her. She looked around the room. No one seemed out of place. But then, as her gaze swept over the people sitting at tables, she noticed something unsettling. The same faces were everywhere. It wasn't just the same type of person. No, it was the same exact faces. She rubbed her eyes, thinking she was seeing things. But when she looked again, they were still there, seated at different tables, watching her, just like the shadows that had followed her. The line between the real world and the terror inside her mind was becoming impossible to distinguish. She couldn't tell who she could trust anymore. She couldn't trust the people around her, and she couldn't trust herself. Emily confronts the collective in the heart of 12th Avenue, where the final ritual is set to take place. She discovers that the group's leader is someone she once trusted, and she must face the horrific truth about the group's influence on her own life. The heart of 12th Avenue was a place Emily had come to loathe. The crumbling buildings, the hollow streets, and the oppressive darkness seemed to be a reflection of the evil she was now chasing. She had spent days running, hiding, and fighting for survival, but now she had nowhere left to run. Her investigation had led her to a final destination, the place where everything connected. The collective had orchestrated everything from the shadows, and now she was walking straight into their heart. It was an old, abandoned building deep within 12th Avenue, one that no one ever dared to enter. The windows were blackened, the front door locked with a thick chain, and the air around it was thick with a sense of dread. This was where the final ritual was set to take place, where the collective would cement their power and ensure that the disappearances would continue, forever feeding their dark influence over the city. Emily had learned the truth. The collective was no ordinary criminal syndicate. They were a secret society, an ancient group that had wielded power for centuries. Their rituals were more than just a means to control. They were meant to keep the dark power alive, to keep feeding the shadows that lurked in the city's deepest corners. And the fire in the warehouse had only been the beginning, a catalyst for their final goal, the permanent merging of the living world with the shadows. Now, Emily was standing at the edge of it all, ready to confront whatever lay inside. She had armed herself with the knowledge she had uncovered, the history, the symbols, the rituals, but she knew that knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. She had to face the collective, the very people who had manipulated her, watched her every move, and worst of all, played with her life. As Emily stepped through the creaking door of the building, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The air was cold, damp, and oppressive, almost suffocating. She could hear whispers, the faint sound of distant chanting, but there was no sign of movement, no indication of who was there. She moved cautiously through the shadows, her footsteps silent against the worn, cracked floors. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But Emily had come too far to stop now. She entered a large room at the center of the building, a space dominated by an ancient stone altar, dark symbols carved into the walls, and a circle of people standing around it. The chanting grew louder, and Emily's breath caught in her throat when she saw who was leading the ceremony. Standing at the altar was none other than Pat, her colleague, the man who had mentored her, who had shown her the ropes at the newspaper, and who had been by her side for months. Her mind reeled. Pat was the leader of the collective. He was the one orchestrating the disappearances, the one behind the entire ritual. Emily couldn't fathom it. Everything she had believed about him was a lie. The person she had trusted the most had been playing her all along. Pat turned slowly, his eyes dark, almost black. There was no hint of the friendly, charismatic reporter she had known. The man before her was someone entirely different, someone who had embraced the shadows and become part of the darkness. "Emily," Pat said, his voice smooth, almost calm. "I was hoping you would come. You've done well to make it this far." Emily's chest tightened as she fought to hold her ground. You've been behind all of this, the disappearances, the rituals, everything." Pat's lips curled into a slight smile. "You always had an instinct for the truth, Emily, but some truths are better left uncovered. You've been a pawn in this game for far longer than you realize." Emily's mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Why? Why me? Why this city? Pat stepped closer, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "Because you were always meant to be here, Emily. The moment you stepped into this city, you became part of something much bigger. You were chosen. Just like the others who disappeared, you were always destined to be a part of the ritual, a catalyst to bring the collective's power into the light." He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, and she recoiled instinctively. "You don't understand, Emily. We're not just a group of criminals. We are the keepers of something ancient, something powerful. We control the city's fate. And you, Emily, are going to help us complete the ritual. You'll be the final piece." Emily stood frozen, the shock of the revelation crashing over her. Pat wasn't just an accomplice or a mentor. He was the leader of the darkness she had been chasing. The man who had guided her, who had made her feel safe, had been using her as a tool to further the goals of the collective. The weight of the betrayal felt like it might suffocate her. Had it all been a lie? Were the late-night meetings, the casual conversations, the times they had shared together, just part of his plan to manipulate her? "You used me. she whispered, her voice shaking with the realization. You let me dig into these disappearances so you could get closer to the truth, but it was always your plan to bring me here, to bring me to this moment. Pat nodded slowly. Exactly. You were perfect for the role, Emily. You had the right skills, the right instincts, and more importantly, you were the missing piece. You didn't even know it, but you've been working for us from the very beginning. You think you've been uncovering the truth, but you've been feeding into our plan, and now, the ritual is almost complete. Emily's heart hammered in her chest. The room was spinning. She had no idea how much of what she had believed was a lie. The collective wasn't just a criminal group. It was a powerful, ancient force, and she had unknowingly been drawn into it. But Emily wasn't going to let this happen. She had come too far to let herself be a pawn in their game. You don't get to control me, she spat, her voice gaining strength. I'm not part of your ritual. You're not going to use me to finish whatever twisted ceremony you have planned. Pat's expression hardened. You don't understand, Emily. The ritual is already in motion. There's no stopping it now. The room seemed to close in on her as Emily looked around. The members of the collective were standing in a circle, their eyes dark and vacant, all of them complicit in the ritual. But Emily knew that she couldn't just stand there and accept their control. She had a choice, and that choice was to stop it before it was too late. I won't let you do this, she said, her voice stronger now. I'll stop you no matter what it takes. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily scanned the room. The altar was close, only a few steps away. If she could reach it, if she could destroy whatever it was that tied the collective to their power, maybe she could stop the ritual. But Pat was already moving toward her, a sinister smile on his face. You think you can stop this? You're too far gone, Emily. We've already won. Emily didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, grabbing a metal rod from the nearby debris. She swung it at the altar, the sound of metal striking stone echoing in the cavernous room. The collective's members stepped back, but Pat's expression remained unchanged. You're too late, Emily, he said, his voice filled with pity. You can't fight what's already been set in motion. But Emily wasn't listening to him anymore. With one final, desperate cry, she smashed the rod into the altar, sending a shockwave of energy throughout the room. The air grew thick, and the shadows that had been hanging in the corners of the room suddenly came to life, swirling around Emily, pulling at her. Emily uncovers the horrifying price of exposing the truth. Her own sanity is tested as she tries to stop the ritual. The collective's power is beyond what she imagined, and her exposure of them may come at a personal cost that she wasn't prepared for. The days following Emily's confrontation with the collective were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and confusion. Despite stopping the ritual, she had only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. There was still so much more to the darkness she had unearthed, and every step she took seemed to pull her deeper into the abyss. The shadows that had followed her since the beginning of the investigation now seemed to haunt her mind, not just her steps. Emily couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, even in the safety of her own apartment. The whispers that had once been just faint noises were now louder, clearer, as if they were trying to tell her something. In the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts, the weight of the truth she had uncovered began to crush her. The people who had vanished, the rituals she had disrupted, the dark influence that had been woven into the very fabric of the city, it was too much to bear. Every day felt like a battle, not just with the forces she had exposed, but with her own mind. She couldn't help but ask herself, what had she really stopped? She had interrupted their ritual, but had she truly freed anyone? The shadows were still there, lingering in the background, and Emily began to wonder if she had done enough, or if she had merely delayed the inevitable. The strain of the investigation had already begun to show on Emily. Her sleep was disturbed by nightmares that blurred the line between reality and fantasy. She dreamed of dark figures, of people she had seen disappear, reaching out to her from the shadows, their faces twisted in agony. Every night, she awoke in a cold sweat, unable to shake the feeling that the shadows were reaching into her mind. During the day, it was no better. She could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was just the whispering remnants of fear that clung to her every thought. Was the figure she had seen outside her window the night before truly there? Or was it just her mind playing tricks? Even simple tasks, like going to the store or meeting someone for coffee, now felt like dangerous missions. Every face seemed suspicious. Every step felt like it was being monitored. Her heart would race, her palms would sweat, and she'd feel her throat tighten as if she was constantly being hunted. She tried to focus on the facts, to push through the fear and exhaustion, but the psychological toll was becoming too much to bear. Emily began to question whether she was losing herself, whether the very act of exposing the collective had already cost her more than she was willing to pay. She had known the risks of investigating such dark forces, but she had never imagined that it would cost her mind, her sense of reality. Emily's fears reached their peak one evening when she found herself standing outside the Tilden warehouse again. She had promised herself she would never return, but something deep inside her told her that she hadn't truly escaped the dark forces at play. Something was pulling her back, and she couldn't resist. As she approached the building, she saw a figure in the distance. It was Pat, the leader of the collective, but he wasn't alone. Around him were members of the group, people she recognized, people who had once seemed so ordinary. Marge, Danny Marks, even her own co-workers. They were standing in a circle, and their faces were not their own. They were empty, devoid of life, as though they were puppets controlled by something far beyond their comprehension. Pat turned to her, his smile cold and knowing. "You thought you had stopped it, didn't you, Emily? You thought you could expose us, end our power, but you've only just begun to see the truth." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" Pat took a step closer, his eyes glinting with something far more sinister than she had ever seen. "You think you've stopped the ritual, but in reality, you've completed it. You've done exactly what we needed you to do." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces finally clicked into place. The shadows, the disappearances, the whispers. It wasn't just about power and control. It was about feeding something much older, much darker. The collective had been playing her from the very start. Her investigation, her attempts to expose them, had only been a catalyst. Emily had thought she was fighting against them, but she had unknowingly been doing their bidding, unknowingly feeding their ritual with every step she took. She had been their perfect pawn. A sense of dread washed over Emily as the realization settled into her bones. The ritual wasn't over. It had never been about stopping it, it had been about completing it. The final step, the one she had unknowingly taken, had unleashed the power the collective had been seeking. She looked around at the people standing in the circle, her colleagues, her neighbors, her friends, all of them under the collective's control, their eyes hollow, their faces expressionless. She understood now. They weren't just part of the group, they were part of the ritual itself, bound to the shadows that had been fed by their disappearances. Emily's mind screamed for her to run, but she couldn't. The power they had unleashed was too strong, and she realized with sickening clarity that she had to be the one to finish it. She had to stop the ritual once and for all. The energy in the air grew thick, suffocating, as the shadows began to take form, swirling around Emily. The group's influence over the city was complete, and she could feel the darkness closing in. But there was still hope. There was still a way out. "I won't let you control me, Pat," Emily said, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let you control anyone anymore." In that moment, Emily knew what she had to do. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone she had lost, the victims, the people under the collective's influence, and the city that had been consumed by the darkness. With everything she had left, Emily raised her hands and began to chant the words she had uncovered, the ancient runes she had deciphered from the warehouse walls. The words felt foreign, alien, but they were the key to stopping the ritual. As she spoke the incantation, the shadows around her began to recoil, pulling back from her, weakening. Pat's face twisted in anger. "You can't stop it, Emily. You're too late." But Emily wasn't listening anymore. With every word she spoke, she felt the darkness weaken, the power of the collective fading. She was undoing what had been done. She was breaking the seal that had been placed on the city. After a climactic battle, Emily manages to expose the collective, but the city is forever changed. The story ends with her realizing that not all dark secrets can be fully erased, and some shadows never go away. The city was quiet for the first time in months. The oppressive, suffocating energy that had hung over 12th Avenue, that dark aura of fear and control, seemed to dissipate. The shadows that once seemed to stretch endlessly across the streets were no longer as powerful. The collective had been exposed, their secrets brought to light in a way that no one could deny. The truth was out. Emily stood at the center of the aftermath, feeling the weight of what had happened. Her body was bruised, exhausted, and worn from the battle, but her mind was still racing. There had been victories. The final ritual had been stopped, and the collective had been brought down. Their influence shattered, but the victory came at a cost. Emily could feel it in the very air around her. Nothing could undo what had been done. The darkness, though diminished, still lingered like a residual fog that couldn't be fully cleared away. It was hard to describe, but Emily knew it in her bones. The city had changed, and so had she. The exposure of the collective had thrown the city into chaos. The government was scrambling to cover up its involvement, and the media frenzy was relentless. Emily's articles had been published in every paper. The once quiet journalist was now a national sensation. She was hailed as a hero, a woman who had brought down a powerful, secretive organization, but she knew the truth was far darker. There was no clean slate, no redemption in the aftermath. It wasn't just the collective that had been broken, it was the city's soul. The aftermath of Emily's exposure was a mixed bag. On one hand, there was a sense of relief. The public finally knew what had been happening behind the scenes, how they had been manipulated by powerful figures in the city. Many were shocked, some were angry, and others were confused. How could they not have seen it? How could they have let the collective control them for so long? But even more unsettling than the anger was the emptiness. The truth had come out, but there was no grand resolution. The city was scarred, deeply affected by the revelations that had shaken its foundation. Some people were afraid to speak about what had happened, while others were still trying to piece together how they had all been unknowingly part of the conspiracy. The powers that be, politicians, law enforcement, business leaders, had been involved in some way, and even though the most public figures had been arrested or disgraced, the sense of corruption didn't fully disappear. The collective's reach was deep. and Emily realized that the city was built on secrets. No matter how much exposure or scandal there were always layers of darkness waiting to resurface. The collective had been a symptom of a much larger illness, a society built on control, fear, and exploitation. It was clear now that the battle had not been won entirely. The city could no longer look at itself the same way. As Emily watched the people of the city react, she felt a deep disconnection from them. She had uncovered the truth, and she had stopped the immediate threat, but the damage was done. People moved on, pretending like it hadn't happened, but Emily couldn't forget. She could never forget what she had seen, what she had learned. Some truths were too dark to be fully erased. Sitting in her apartment one quiet evening, Emily stared out the window at the bustling city below. The noise, the lights, the traffic, it all seemed so empty now. For the first time, she felt the weight of the city's secrets pressing down on her. It was as if every person, every building, every shadow in the corner of her eye held a story she would never fully understand. The battle with the collective had been physical, emotional, and psychological. Emily had given everything she had, her energy, her time, her peace of mind. The city had been broken open, and in doing so she had exposed a deeper, darker undercurrent of truth. But now that it was out there, she couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of loss. She had stopped the collective, but she hadn't stopped the system they represented. She hadn't stopped the shadow that loomed over the city, the power dynamics that still controlled everything. The collective was gone, but the infrastructure of fear and control remained. The city might never fully recover. The shadows might never leave. The damage done to her own psyche was permanent, and Emily wondered if it was all worth it. Was exposing the truth enough to justify the cost? Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text message from Megan, her only remaining friend in the city. "You okay?" It was a simple message, one that felt so distant now, as if there were miles between them instead of just a few blocks. Emily hesitated before replying. How could she explain everything to Megan? How could she explain that she had one, yet felt so profoundly empty? She typed out a response but never hit send. Instead, she turned off her phone, letting the silence fill the room. The truth had come at a cost, and Emily was left wondering if the price had been too high. She had exposed the darkness, but she realized that not all shadows could be erased. They would always be there, lurking in the corners, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The truth had set the city free, but it had also condemned Emily to live in the aftermath, a place where the lines between reality and fear were forever blurred. It had been several months since Emily had exposed the collective, and the city was still grappling with the fallout. The collective's hold over the city had finally been broken, their secrets unveiled for the public to see. The authorities had arrested many of its members, and the rituals that had fueled their power were disrupted. To the outside world, Emily was a hero, a symbol of truth and courage. On the surface, life seemed to return to normal. Emily resumed her job at the Midway Post, her articles continuing to be published, and her name recognized in both the media and law enforcement for her groundbreaking work. She began to reconnect with old friends, and people treated her like she had achieved something remarkable. But despite the outward appearance of a peaceful life, Emily knew something was wrong. A lingering unease had settled within her, like a constant shadow, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had not fully escaped the collective's influence. The sense of victory was shallow, and a nagging suspicion gnawed at her every day. The lights in her apartment would flicker occasionally, and the air always seemed a little too cold, even when it was warm outside. At night, she could swear she heard whispers, faint voices just beyond hearing, but when she woke, there was never anyone there. The shadows that had plagued her during her investigation still seemed to haunt her. Despite the public relief, Emily's mind couldn't settle. She had stopped the ritual, but had she truly stopped the collective? And if not, what did that mean for her? There was still a darkness lingering in the corners of her life, and it wouldn't let go. It started slowly at first. Unexplainable occurrences that Emily tried to brush off. At night, when she was sitting at her desk, the lights in her apartment would flicker. Sometimes the bulb above her kitchen would hum loudly, vibrating as if it were struggling to stay on. It would always flicker once, then dim, and then go back to normal. The electrical issues were sporadic and nothing too concerning, at least not at first. But over time, the strange happenings became more frequent. Odd sounds at night, footsteps, dragging sounds like something, or someone, was walking around her apartment when she knew she was alone. Sometimes, when she would walk through the hall, she'd catch a glimpse of shadowy figures darting out of the corner of her eye. At first, she thought it was just the stress of everything she had gone through, the months of intense pressure, but the occurrences were too consistent to ignore. One night, as she was lying in bed trying to sleep, a sudden chill swept across her body. She woke with a start, sitting up and looking around her dark room. Her heart pounded in her chest, but the apartment was silent. Everything seemed normal. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw it. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, passing by her window. The figure moved quickly, almost gliding, and the sensation of being watched flooded her entire body. She felt paralyzed, as though the air itself had become thick and oppressive. She couldn't see clearly, just the outline of a figure, but she knew it wasn't a person. It was something else, something darker. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure vanished, and Emily scrambled out of bed, rushing to the window. But the street below was empty. Nothing was out of place, but her mind knew better. She wasn't safe. The collective's influence hadn't disappeared with the ritual. It had followed her, and now it was back, lingering in the shadows. As the days wore on, Emily began to notice something disturbing. Her relationships with friends and colleagues were beginning to deteriorate. It started with subtle shifts. Conversations that once felt easy and warm now felt distant and cold. Her friends would avoid eye contact, their voices flat when they spoke to her. It was as if they didn't want to acknowledge her, or worse, as if they didn't really see her anymore. She tried to reach out, but it was like there was an invisible wall between them. Her old life, the life she had before the collective, felt like it was slipping away, piece by piece. Even with Megan, her closest friend, things felt off. Megan would give her strange looks, almost like she was afraid of her, as though she were infected by whatever darkness Emily had uncovered. One evening, Emily invited Megan over for dinner, hoping to reconnect, but the conversation was strained. Megan didn't seem interested in the topics Emily tried to discuss. When Emily mentioned the strange things happening in her apartment, Megan just nodded, her gaze distant. "Maybe you need to take a break, Emily," Megan said softly, her voice almost apologetic. "You've been through a lot lately." Emily's stomach tightened. "I'm fine, Megan, really." But Megan didn't meet her eyes. Instead, she just smiled weakly and excused herself early, leaving Emily with the overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. Was it Emily? Had she changed? Or had the darkness of the collective started to creep into the people around her, infecting everything she touched? It didn't matter where Emily went, the shadows followed her. The whispers grew louder, and the sense of unease became a constant companion. No matter how far she ran, She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being pulled back into something she had already escaped. It was as though the city itself had a hold on her, and 12th Avenue was still waiting for her. Even when she left the city to visit family or friends in neighboring towns, she felt like she couldn't escape. The shadows, the whispers, they were with her, following her every step. The past wouldn't let go, and Emily felt like she was reliving it, trapped in an endless cycle of fear and regret. She couldn't move forward, she couldn't be free. No matter where she went, she was always reminded of the darkness she had uncovered. It felt like a curse, a burden she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. One evening, Emily sat alone in her apartment, staring at the pile of old notes from her investigation. She could see the remnants of her old life, the articles she had written, the documents she had uncovered, the truth she had exposed. But now those things felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. She glanced at the clock. It was late, but she couldn't sleep. She hadn't been able to sleep in weeks. Her mind raced, and she started to question everything. Was it worth it? Had exposing the collective truly set the city free, or had it only unleashed something worse? Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a text from Megan. "I'm worried about you. Please talk to me." Emily stared at the message for a long time before putting the phone back down. She didn't know how to explain what was happening to her, how her reality had started to shift, how she was beginning to doubt her own sanity. The truth she had uncovered, the horrors she had witnessed, it was all becoming a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The whispers were louder now, and the shadows seemed to be closing in once again. Had she really stopped the collective, or had they just let her think she had won? Emily realized with a sickening feeling in her chest that the darkness had always been there. She had never truly escaped it, and now it was a part of her, something she could never forget. She had exposed the truth, but at what cost? Was the truth worth her sanity, or had she too become part of the cycle? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain. The shadows of 12th Avenue were not done with her yet. They never would be. For weeks, Emily had felt a semblance of peace. After everything she had uncovered, she had hoped the darkness that had haunted her would finally fade away. But as time passed, the world around her felt more fragile, and the calm she had experienced seemed unnatural, like the eye of a storm. The shadows, though distant for a time, had returned slowly. At first, it was just a feeling, the sense that someone was watching her, lurking just beyond her line of sight. Then one day, Emily received a package in the mail, an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of the missing person she had investigated, people she had uncovered in her search for truth. She had seen their faces before. She could still recall their names. They were part of the list of the disappeared, the people whose stories had been buried under layers of deception and rituals. But the photo was more than just a reminder. It was a message. The same people she had fought to expose were now staring at her from this photograph, a symbol of her failure and the unfinished business that remained. The images were grainy and faded, but their expressions were frozen in a way that sent a chill down Emily's spine. The darkness wasn't gone, it was returning. Emily couldn't ignore the signs any longer. They had returned with a vengeance. At first, it started small. She'd catch a glimpse of something shifting in the corner of her eye, a fleeting shadow moving in the periphery. But then it grew more blatant. One evening, as Emily was returning to her apartment, she saw them, shadowy figures standing in the doorway across from her. They were children, pale and still, with eyes so black they seemed to swallow the light around them. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, but before she could take a step toward them, they disappeared, vanishing into the shadows as if they had never been there at all. But they weren't gone. They were still watching her, lurking in the corners, watching from darkened doorways, peeking around street corners. No matter where Emily went, the black-eyed children were there, following her, waiting. The whispers, the shadows, they were reasserting themselves. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the very fabric of her reality was beginning to unravel. She had fought so hard to free the city from the collective's grip. But now, the shadows had returned to remind her that there were things in this world far darker than she could have ever imagined. As the days went on, Emily's sense of reality started to fracture. She had been staring at the same photographs of the missing people for hours, trying to find some connection, some truth she had missed the first time. But her eyes were tired, her head foggy, and her mind felt like it was slipping into chaos. The shadows, the whispers, the black-eyed children, they were all becoming too much to bear. The paranoia she had fought to suppress came rushing back with full force. Was this really happening, or was it all in her head? Maybe the stress of everything she had uncovered had finally taken its toll. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her, or maybe she was starting to break under the pressure. She tried to convince herself it was just stress, just exhaustion, but deep down she knew. She knew the shadows hadn't left, they had only been waiting. And now they were coming back. One night, she reached for her phone in desperation. She needed to talk to Pat, the one person she had trusted, the one person who might know how to help her. She dialed his number, hoping to hear his familiar voice on the other end. But when he answered, something felt off. "Hello?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Pat, it's Emily." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, in a voice that sent chills down her spine, Pat replied, "Emily, you shouldn't have come back." Before Emily could respond, the line went dead. Click. The call ended abruptly. She stared at her phone, confused and unnerved. But then, as if on cue, a soft giggle came through the speaker. It wasn't Pat, it wasn't anyone she knew. The laughter was eerie, too high-pitched, like the sound of a child's laugh, but it was wrong, distorted, unnatural. The laughter echoed in her ears as she pulled the phone away from her face. She felt her heart race, her palms sweat. Was this real? Had she truly heard that, or was it another trick of her mind? She had to face the reality. This wasn't just paranoia. Something was wrong. The shadows were coming for her again, and this time they weren't going to let her escape. Emily could feel the walls closing in around her. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The shadows were inside, the whispers were louder, and the black-eyed children were everywhere. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. She needed to confront what had been haunting her. Despite the overwhelming fear, Emily knew there was only one place where the truth might still be hidden: 12th Avenue, the heart of the darkness where it all began. She had to go back, even if it meant confronting her worst fears. Taking a deep breath, Emily made her way to 12th Avenue, her heart pounding in her chest. The street was eerily quiet, almost too quiet, and the buildings stood like silent, dark sentinels watching her approach. When she reached the old, decrepit warehouse, the haunting feeling returned. The very air seemed to hum with a dark energy, as though the building itself was alive, waiting for her. Inside, the familiar chill crept over her skin as she made her way through the shadows. The collective had been here. She knew it. This was their ground zero, their place of power, and no matter how hard she tried to escape it, the darkness always pulled her back. As she stepped deeper into the warehouse, she suddenly heard a familiar voice call out to her from the shadows. "Emily," it said softly, almost a whisper. "I knew you'd come back. Emily froze. She knew that voice. She had trusted it. It was Pat standing in the shadows, his figure barely visible against the darkness. "What are you doing here, Pat?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. I thought you were gone." Pat stepped forward, his face emerging from the shadows, but he didn't look the same. His eyes were still as dark as they had been during their last confrontation, but now there was something emptier about him. He seemed like a shell, an empty vessel filled with nothing but darkness. "You're too late, Emily," Pat said with a strange smile, his tone almost pitying. "The collective never really leaves, and now you're part of it. You always were." Emily's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, I stopped you? I stopped everything." Pat's smile faded. "You think you stopped it, but you don't understand. The power we harness, the shadows we've summoned, they're never gone. They live in the city, in the people, in the rituals. You can't stop them, Emily. You can't stop us. You belong here just like everyone else." Emily's breath hitched as she realized the full scope of what he was saying. She had never truly escaped. The shadows had always been with her, and now they were claiming her. The quiet of the early morning was shattered by the soft clinking of metal against stone, as Emily and Pat walked through the crumbling buildings on 12th Avenue. The city had never fully recovered from the fallout of the collective's exposure, but the shadows were still very much alive, waiting for the perfect moment to resurface. It was in the heart of this dilapidated section of the city that Emily now found herself once again, drawn to the ruins of a forgotten world that had manipulated and controlled people for decades. The buildings, once bustling with life, now stood as hollow reminders of the past. Their empty windows stared out like blank eyes, and the air around them felt thick, charged with a sense of something unnatural. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she gazed at the structure in front of her, the Tilden warehouse, where so many of the ritual's horrors had unfolded. This was the place where the rituals had begun, and now it was where she had to face the past. Pat was silent beside her, his face unreadable, but Emily could sense his unease. She knew he hadn't been entirely honest with her. He had played a pivotal role in the collective's plan, and now he seemed like a man bound by guilt, but also by something much darker. "This is where it all started," Emily said quietly, looking up at the ruins. "The rituals, the disappearances, everything that's happened to me." Pat nodded slowly. "This place holds secrets, dark ones. You haven't seen the half of it, Emily." They began to move forward, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the corners of the buildings were watching them, waiting for them to disturb the dormant forces inside. Every step she took felt like it was pulling her closer to the edge, where there was no turning back. Emily's focus was clear now. She had to uncover what the collective had left behind, and she knew it would be the key to stopping whatever ritual they were trying to reawaken. As they made their way deeper into the heart of the warehouse, Emily felt the eerie, familiar pull of something she couldn't fully comprehend. There was a sense of movement in the air, an energy she hadn't felt since she first uncovered the collective's dark rituals. This place was not just a building. It was a gateway, a portal that bridged the gap between the human world and something much darker. The deeper Emily and Pat ventured, the more it became clear that the ritual hadn't truly ended. It had merely been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Emily discovered old, ancient symbols carved into the stone walls, markings that were far older than the building itself. She recognized them, the same runes she had seen during her investigation, the ones that had been used to summon the shadows, to open the gateways. As she deciphered the markings, a chilling realization struck her. The ritual wasn't about power. It was about connecting the human world with the shadow world permanently. The collective wasn't just trying to gain influence or control. They were trying to create an eternal bond between the two worlds, to pull the supernatural into the realm of the living. "What do you mean, Pat?" Emily whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "They've been trying to bring it back this whole time. They were never going to stop." Pat was silent for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was tinged with regret. "They were never supposed to stop, Emily. The ritual, it's never really over. The collective doesn't just seek power. They want to merge the worlds to bring the shadows into our reality for good." Emily felt her heart race as the implications of his words sank in. She had known that the collective's power was dangerous, but she had never realized the full extent of their ambition. This wasn't just about controlling people, it was about reshaping reality itself. The moment Emily made the realization, the shadows seemed to grow stronger, more alive. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the building, soft, deliberate, as if something or someone was walking just behind her. Turning quickly, she saw them. The children with black eyes, the same figures she had seen before, but now they were closer, more tangible, their presence undeniable. They emerged from the darkness like specters, their black eyes glowing like twin pools of void, staring at her with an almost malevolent intent. They didn't just lurk in the corners of her vision anymore. They were right in front of her, moving toward her slowly as if they had been waiting for her. Emily took a step back, her body instinctively freezing in place. "Pat," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What are they? What do they want?" Pat turned to face the children, his expression grim. "They're not children, Emily. They're shadows, manifestations of the darkness that the collective has been using to fuel their power. They don't want anything from you. They are just a part of the ritual." The chill in the air thickened and the temperature dropped. Emily could feel the pressure building in the room, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The shadows seemed to move with purpose now, not just standing there but advancing toward her. She realized that the ritual wasn't just about the past anymore, it was happening right now. The shadows, the darkness, were growing stronger, feeding off her fear, drawing her in. Emily's heart raced, but there was no escape. She was already part of the ritual. And as she stood there, frozen by the eerie gaze of the children, she understood one painful truth. She wasn't just fighting the collective. She was fighting the ritual itself, a ritual that had already claimed her. The tension in the room was suffocating as Emily turned to Pat, her eyes wide with realization. "You knew all of this, didn't you? You knew what the collective was trying to do." Pat didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the advancing shadows, his voice barely audible. "I was part of it, Emily. I still am. I never wanted to be. But once you're in, there's no getting out, not until the ritual is complete." Emily's blood ran cold. "So, you're telling me that everything I've done, everything I've fought for, it was all part of their plan?" Pat nodded slowly. "It's always been part of the plan. They never wanted to destroy the city, not really. They wanted to merge it with the shadows to create a world where the two realms coexist. They were going to use the people, the disappearances, the chaos, all of it, to bring about the final connection." Emily took a shaky step forward, confronting him with the anger she could no longer contain. "You let me expose the collective. You let me think I was doing something good, but it was all just a game to you." Pat turned to face her now, his eyes dark and hollow. "I never wanted you to get involved, but I couldn't stop you. You were always meant to uncover the truth, Emily. You were part of the ritual all along. You didn't even know it. You completed it. And now the worlds will merge forever. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her head spinning with the weight of the decision she had to make. She had come so far, had exposed the collective, had broken their power. But now it was clear that everything she had done had been part of a much darker plan. The ritual had always been in motion, and Emily had unknowingly fueled it. She had a choice to make: destroy the ritual completely, risk her own life, and tear down everything the collective had built, or let them succeed and allow the shadow world to merge with the human world forever. It would change everything, but the truth was far more personal than Emily could have ever imagined. Pat, the man she had trusted, the one who had mentored her, revealed something horrifying. The collective's leader had a hidden connection to her family, one that explained why Emily had been drawn to the case in the first place. Her investigation hadn't just been about exposing a dark force, it had been preordained. "Emily," Pat said softly, his voice strained. "You were always meant to be part of this. The ritual, the shadows, they are in your blood. You have a choice. Let it happen, or stop it forever." Emily stared at him, heart torn between fury and despair. This was her final chance. She could break the cycle, destroy the collective, and risk everything for the truth, or she could let it continue becoming part of the darkness forever. With trembling hands, Emily stepped forward, ready to face the truth, no matter the cost. The city was strangely still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the final confrontation that would decide its fate. Emily stood at the edge of the forgotten warehouse district once again, but this time she wasn't alone. Pat, the man who had once guided her, was at her side, though his presence felt more like a shadow than a friend. The path they had walked together had led them to this point, to a secret location buried deep within the remnants of 12th Avenue, where the final ritual was set to unfold. This was it, the end game. The ritual that had started long ago, the one that Emily had fought to expose, was now ready to reach its final stage. As she looked at the old, crumbling building before her, a sense of foreboding washed over her. She could feel the energy inside it, a dark, pulsating force that seemed to hum with a life of its own. This wasn't just a battle for control over the city. It was a battle for the very fabric of reality itself. But Emily wasn't just fighting the collective anymore. No, this was a battle against something much larger, something that could manipulate the laws of reality itself. The rules she had once known no longer applied. This was a world that operated on its own dark logic, one where the line between the physical and the supernatural was blurred beyond recognition. "Are you ready?" Pat asked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a mixture of resignation and something darker, something almost eager. Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Ready or not, it's time to end this. They walked toward the entrance of the building, their steps echoing through the empty streets. As they crossed the threshold, Emily knew there was no turning back. What lay ahead was beyond anything she had ever faced, a confrontation with forces that defied comprehension, with power that had shaped the world from the shadows for centuries. The doors of the warehouse groaned open, and a suffocating cold air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay and something far darker, a sense of ancient power that clung to the air like a thick fog. Inside, the vast space was bathed in dim, flickering light. The altar stood at the center, a place where the final ritual would take place. Emily's eyes scanned the room, but it was not just the physical beings of the collective she had to worry about now. The room seemed to warp around her. The walls moved, the floor shifted, Nothing felt solid. It was as though the very space itself had become fluid, bending to the will of whatever force the collective had unleashed. And then they appeared. Not just men and women in cloaks. The collective's true form emerged from the shadows. The members of the collective were no longer mere humans. They had been transformed, their bodies twisted and distorted by the dark magic they had been using for so long. Their eyes were black, their faces hollow, as if their souls had been consumed by the very power they sought to control. But it wasn't just them. The shadows themselves seemed to take form, rising up around Emily, manifesting as monstrous creatures made of darkness and smoke. The children, the ones with black eyes, were now fully present, standing at the forefront of these shadowy entities, their eyes glowing with malice. Pat moved to the altar, his eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light, and Emily could feel the air growing heavier, pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just a physical battle, it was a supernatural war, one where the laws of reality were being bent to the collective's will. They were manipulating everything, and Emily was nothing but a pawn in their game. "You can't stop this, Emily." Pat's voice echoed through the room, distorted like a whisper in a storm. "You were always meant to be part of this." Emily's body trembled, but she didn't move. The shadows were closing in around her, but there was no fear left in her. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let it end in failure. She had seen the true horror of the collective, and she knew now what she had to do. With a fierce determination, she reached for the rune-covered stone she had uncovered earlier in her investigation, the one that had been the key to breaking the ritual. As she held it in her hand, the energy around her surged, like a wave of power that threatened to consume her. The darkness responded, and the shadows grew stronger. But Emily wasn't going to back down. She had been chosen for this battle, and she was ready to end it once and for all. The battle between Emily and the collective intensified, the air thick with the clash of energies, the very fabric of reality tearing at the seams. Emily chanted the incantation she had memorized, the words flowing from her lips like a song of defiance against the darkness. As the power surged through her, the shadows recoiled, and the supernatural entities writhed in pain. Emily could feel the weight of their power, but she knew she had to hold on. With one final, desperate push, Emily slammed the rune-covered stone into the altar, and a burst of light erupted from the center of the room. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the energy of the ritual was shattered. The darkness began to recede, and the members of the collective fell to the ground, their twisted forms returning to human shape. But even as the ritual collapsed, Emily knew that the victory was temporary. The energy of the ritual had been severed, but the cost was high. Her body ached with the strain, and she could feel the darkness still lingering in the corners of her mind. She had won, but at what price? As the room fell silent, Emily looked around at the members of the collective, who were now lying on the ground, unconscious or perhaps dead. Pat was motionless, his eyes darkened, but his expression seemed almost peaceful, as though he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Emily looked down at him, knowing that the man she had once trusted was no longer part of this world. Emily stood alone in the aftermath of the battle, her breath heavy, her body exhausted. She had stopped the collective. She had broken the ritual. But the world she had saved was forever changed. The city would never be the same, and neither would she. As she walked through the ruins of the warehouse, the shadows still clung to her, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. The fight was over, but the war was far from finished. Emily knew now that she had not just been fighting for the city, but for her own soul, for her place in a world where darkness could still hold sway. Back at her apartment, Emily stared out the window at the city that had once been her home. The shadows were gone for now, but she knew they would return. They always did. She had learned the hard way that some darknesses couldn't be defeated completely. They were a part of the world, part of human nature, and no matter how much she fought, they would always be there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Emily sighed, her thoughts drifting to the people she had lost, to the darkness that had followed her. She had done what she could, but she knew one thing for certain. The shadows would always be with her, lingering just beyond the veil of reality, a constant reminder of the cost of truth. The battle was won, but the shadow of the collective would never truly disappear, and neither would Emily.